Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event. My name is Peter Sharratt. I'm delighted to be talking to you about a subject that's very dear to my heart, and it's really about the role of design. I think as we all started and worked together and grew up and through a design process, the possibility for design to influence the world in a positive way was very much part of the education and the DNA. Now I think it's moved for me into a space where we need to rethink and reinvent growth. And I think design really has a relevance and application beyond perhaps just designing a building or a thing or an artifact to actually look at a wider level of engagement. So for me, it's always started with design. And you might say that design is the first signal of human intent. And if you go along with that statement, then you've got to ask yourself, well, if I'm a designer, so what do we intend by design? Now, we probably can answer that to our clients where we're going to design you a building, but the questions we're now being asked is, well, what do we intend as design professionals, but what do we intend as citizens? And ultimately, we are now having to address the question about what do we intend as a species, as we look at some of the very significant challenges that we have to the way we live going forward. And you'll be very familiar with the what I find is the most condensed version in understanding sustainability. If we look at resource consumption and degradation of habitats, and we look at it in terms of land take, our most advanced economies are running at a 5 or 6 planet level model. Europeans, we're probably operating on 2. India and China, we're operating on 3. India and China probably on 2, but fast approaching the 3 or the 4 to 5 planet model. So when you put climate change on top of that, we have some real issues, and the business as usual approach really just won't cut it. And a lot of that has to do with efficiency thinking. We can improve, we can reduce and reduce, but while we urbanize and while we grow, efficiency is not going to get us to a one planet living model. We need to radically rethink. And I put this up because this is interesting. This is very much related to work of Bill McDonough, and I had the privilege and pleasure of working in China around cradle-to-cradle city models. But this is what President Hu Jintao said. We should optimize the economic structure and advocate an environmentally friendly way of production, life, consumption, and bring about a virtuous cycle in both our ecological and socio-economic systems. He's really talking about resetting the buttons on growth, rethinking it within the confines of a planet. So what does that really mean for how we approach problem solving? Well, we need to shift our focus beyond improving the efficiency of what is to redesign what could be. And we can do that using strategic design principles to reinvent the way that we plan for growth. Now, this is very much an agenda set out by a great colleague of mine, Marco Steinberg, formerly at Harvard, and Citra on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, really looking at what those mean in an urban setting. So we can state that on one side of the equation, and we'll talk about some of the design responses, in particular to climate change, which is a very topical issue. But actually, the other part of the talk I want to touch on is really helping organizations reinvent the way they operate. So while we as designers focus on building design or product design, there is also organizational design, and helping organizations cross the line from what could be to what is can be the most difficult and challenging aspect of the whole kind of enterprise. So a little bit we'll talk about on that towards the end. But the first part, predominantly, how's strategic design thinking around global warming issues, and a couple of examples will come through. So where are we trying to get to in this whole warming debate? Broadly speaking, on a business as usual projection, we're looking at a 4 to 4.8 degree global average warming by the end of the century. And then we're kind of looking at a number of committed targets, policies, voluntary agreements. We are struggling to keep through the current kind of policy framework to around 2 degrees. And you'll be hopefully familiar with the idea of science-based targets, which are really used to help target design to keep temperatures below the 2-degree target. And there are a variety of ways of doing that. We've had, and I've seen in the past, a huge reliance on legislation. You know, tell us what the codes are and we'll meet the code, and then we'll carry on and we'll exceed code for a certain number of circumstances and clients. And this is just a chart of the development of environmental legislation in the US over the last 100 years or so. But of course, what that tells me is that that is a sign of complexity, but a sign that of failure of design. We should not be trying to eliminate toxins from buildings or improve air quality that meet basic standards of human comfort and welfare. So clearly things have gone awry in the past. So the regulatory approach is probably not going to be one that will lead us to where we need to get to, nor particularly with this, where we're looking at rapid urbanization. World's top 3 megacities with just 20% of the world's population generating 14% of capital and growth. Just 2% of the world's surface generating 80% of the world's wealth. And a lot of those cities are already there and pre-existing. So design innovation is on new build, but really about 70 or 80% of existing buildings that we see as we walk around our homes and our cities will be in use by 2040. And heating and cooling of those buildings probably account for today around about 50 or 75% of the emissions, depending on location. And I'm doing this broadcast at the minute from Abu Dhabi, where even though it's towards the end of September, daily temperatures are still 36, 38, and they're telling me their summers here are now lasting 2 months longer this year than they have in previous years, the hottest ones on record. And of course, the impact of this is really quite profound. You look at tourism, the summer season will be longer, construction will impact, the number of days over 40 degrees will increase 8 times. There'll be an 8 to 10% increase in electricity demand, 5% reduction in generating efficiency, and so on. So a lot of these impacts our cities are struggling to cope with now. And these were one of the guiding principles around the Green Building Regulatory System, which was a project that I did with colleagues here, really trying to understand how you can use design to meet those kind of challenges almost at a country level and city level. And of course, Masdar City, where we took on board some of those very unique and specific challenges around climate and water to see how we could reinvent the model of a modern city. And the thing about this was it was not car dependent. It wasn't because cars were hugely consuming of energy or carbon, but to accommodate cars in a city, you had to have wide streets. And it was the width of the streets that actually meant the city became unwalkable. And the models that we were looking at, and typically, if you look at somebody in desert climates who have lived there successfully for 2,000 years, you can generally pick up really good understanding of how to live in a hot environment. So these became the prototypes: confined perimeter edge, narrow streets, deep shaded, flat roofs to collect water when it did rain, store it in cisterns, high thermal mass, local building material, white painted to reflect solar radiation, and so on. So in essence, we really need to recover the understanding that there was. And there was a lot of detailed analysis. Matthias Schuler from Transolar, for instance, this is some of the analysis that it got into in relation to the ability to reduce urban environmental temperatures through urban form. Where we might have here in an open desert 67 degrees, we could bring that down to about 47, 48 by shading, narrow streets, narrow courtyards, and so on. So science and technology give us the tools to actually inform the design, to give resiliency, and to address some of these wider strategic challenges around growth and urbanization. And of course, we have reality to backcast against. These are direct temperature measurements from downtown Abu Dhabi compared to MISEREOR, and we can see on ground 33, asphalt 57. So there are material issues. Other examples from the past, and I show these because these somehow seem to escape notice in relation to nature-based solutions or an understanding of modified nature-based solutions in warming. This is Casa de Pelotas, maybe 250-year-old building. This here, where you sit in this day room, is in between a soft courtyard with a fountain, humidified air, perfume scented, and then a hard paved courtyard over here, and you get natural convection and airflow moving through that space without ducting, air conditioning, or any energy. Very elegant, very simple solution. Or similarly here, the wind catchers in Yads in Iran, displacement, buoyancy driven ventilation and wind assisted became the direct model for naturally passively cooled buildings for India's most advanced pharmaceutical company, the Torrent Corporation, who incorporated very similar ideas within their headquarter building. This, by the way, was with Brian Ford and associates in relation to the design and the modeling. And also here at a brewery in Malta, uses completely natural cooling systems, the thermal inertia of the enveloping walls coupled with nighttime ventilation to actually really halve the energy bill. And we've seen other examples at Seville Expo, the Pelonc, and how you modify microclimates to manipulate and improve the environment. Jumping up a scale, on terms of almost a level of geoengineering, the Dead Sea, interesting case in point. Jordan is one of the only countries that is increasing its land border by 2 meters a year, mainly as the Dead Sea water level drops, principally to do with agricultural offtake of water, but also reducing rainfall patterns in the region. But broadly speaking, a kind of a climate change that needed adaptation around tourism and kind of infrastructure. So the project here became really, how could you design or take those design principles for a whole region, which looked at building and transport and energy and water systems. And one example, this is Foster and Partners. I was involved with this project, a World Bank feasibility study around called Red to Dead. So if the Dead Sea is falling, can you fill it up from the Red Sea? And then on the way, can you exploit the level change that there is to create hydroelectric opportunities to drive desalination, to have a greenification of the desert program that might create food and create new urban growth corridors and development settlements along the line of the canal. So these are all kind of creative solutions that you can bring to bear around these problems, and they operate at different scale. So moving from the building to the infrastructure, to the city, to the region in relation to our strategic design thinking, I just want to talk a little bit around the issue around organizational design. So somehow, while we still have to design the solution, we also need to focus on how we design the architecture of the solution. Again, a very articulate point of view put forward by Marco Steinberg. It's not just about the architecture. We need to understand how organizations work around this space. So some of the design thinking applied maybe here to sector. This was a result of a project I did on trying to look at a carbon neutral growth template for airport. That made me think, well, how would we look at a whole sector to incentivize a sector around low carbon transition when the sector was really saying the economic necessity was to fly, so we cannot really engage with anything to do with reducing carbon or sustainability. So, but this voluntary scheme turned out to really work across the sector, and it now has about a third of global aviation traffic goes through an airport which is participant of this scheme. And there are a very significant number of independently certified carbon neutral airports, a whole separate discussion on carbon neutrality and how you account for it. But again, applying the lessons from one design project and to see how you could leverage them to a whole sector. Another great example of an organization who is leading in this is Lend-Lease. and who have put out some incredibly stretching targets on their mission zero, which is absolute net zero by 2040 for scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And their whole kind of program around that, based on the early stage in Barangaroo, which was the first land deal in New South Wales in Australian history that had mandated as part of the land deal carbon performance standards that cascaded through lease agreements, are about now really engaging their supply chain in part of this design problem. So how do you account for embodied carbon is a key issue. Equally well, we're beginning to see a bit of convergence on investor pressure and initiatives around that. So we have sustainability declaration requirements, the TCFD requirement coming out of government, which is now beginning to mandate different asset classes and promote climate risk through an investor lens. So we're beginning to see a widening of interest in this carbon resilience story that perhaps used to sit with a certain kind of designer, now beginning to look at our regulatory, our policy system, our investing and our funding and our finance. And equally well, an organization like Chewy, who have probably the leading commitment around this in the tourism and infrastructure, but they own 5 airlines, 15 cruise lines, 1,600 agencies, 400 hotels, and they are wholly committed to managing and reducing emissions across the portfolio. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. And so designers, I think, will be very familiar with the idea that eco-labeling will help kind of improve new buildings, but now the palette around this is widening. And it's widening to include not just design, but operational entities, infrastructure, for example, health and well-being, building systems and controls, cities and whole communities are now beginning to come under the purview of these programs that set performance benchmarks, which will aid and assist designers in making the case for investment and good practice in design. But of course, it really now in this world we live in is not about what the designers do. Organizations who will occupy architects and buildings really have to address performance in use. The shift will go from how you design something to really how it operates in practice. And there is no avoiding the reality of how buildings perform in use. So this is where the focus is going to be. And this is where I would argue that designers have an ongoing role to play in engaging with how buildings and products of design should be used optimally. But this is going to be a major focus as we've seen a big gap. As we have seen the bar and the language change from low carbon to carbon neutral to net zero with science-based targets to now carbon positive. It's a very challenging kind of environment. And I think helping organizations understand how to internalize these things and turn those into specific policies, programs, and initiatives that are consistent is going to be where things come forward in the future. And it is a role for designers assisting in that. Here are some of the kind of examples: green leases, for instance, carbon tools, dashboards, power purchasing agreements, integrated renewables, on-site renewables, designing for flexibility, transport-enabled design, microclimates, natural and cooling, smart systems, data metering, and on it goes. And I just want to touch briefly on the role of digitalization. This is Pope's inauguration, 2005. And if you look down here on the bottom right, you'll see one person recording. And then a mere short time later, same view, same event. Everybody has access now to information and visualization. And these are going to be an area that is going to really help drive the effectiveness of our design, but also our understanding. And these are just sort of some examples of work I did with Siemens in Malta in relation to understanding the direct benefits that enhanced technology can make in placemaking. And there's a whole kind of emerging world in this whole systems of integration, real-time information and controls, but equally well, tools for the designers as well. So digital twinning, the ability to create now interfaces between the planned and the unreal against the reality of what gets built against existing context and city, and being able to interrogate a moment of truth that actually goes through a digital planned future into a reality is a key kind of area. Finally, the last slide, it's really, I think for me, principally about designers helping organizations, not just tell them how to do it. This tends to be the technical design. Well, you want a bridge, okay, here's how you design the bridge. You want a tall building, here's how you do it. The question is what to do and why. And I think this is the area of debate that designers used to be in the middle of and then kind of edged out. I would argue now, by widening the understanding of design into strategic design principles to solve complex problems, and a willingness to step beyond perhaps a professional boundary into a different space, which is more transdisciplinary and more literate in other areas that designers may not feel qualified to talk about, is really where the future will be. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it generates some debate and some interest. One thing that I also do is I'm a professor at the University of Westminster part-time, so there's a huge knowledge transfer dimension issue to this, and I was also sort of founding partner for us, a sustainability consultancy based in London.